Welcome to Everything STEAM. I'm your host, Sam Stanford. As a physicist and structural engineer with Jacobs Engineering, I've made many connections with some bright individuals who are either working, studying, or self-taught and passionate about our particular topics of discussion. When was the last time you thought about language, its flaws, and its importance in society? When was the last time you thought about how you would quench a moral dilemma? Or when was the last time you thought about having total control over your decisions versus having no control at all? Well, put your thinking caps on, because today's the day we revisit those topics. To properly visit these topics, I brought on someone who knows what they're talking about, because that person sure isn't me. Our guest not only holds depths in the realms of linguistics and philosophy, but also can deliver with a sense of humor. That guest is Mike Kaplan. Mike is a professional comedian with a background in linguistics and philosophy. He has appeared on The Tonight Show, Conan, Letterman, James Corden, Seth Meyers, Comedy Central, Last Comic Standing, and America's Got Talent. He has a half-hour special on Comedy Central, a 1-hour stand-up special on Amazon called Small, Dork, and Handsome, and a new dry bar special called Live from the Universe, as well as 2 podcasts, The Faucet and Broccoli and Ice Cream. Another interesting thing about Mike is that his debut album, called Vegan Mind Meld, was one of iTunes' top 10 comedy albums of the year, and his newest album, AKA, debuted at number 1 and was called invigoratingly funny by the New York Times. So now that you've been briefly introduced to Mike and the topic of this podcast, we're going to head into the first segment where we plan to talk about the study of language and its structure, as well as how language impacts society at large. Cheers. Mike, welcome to the podcast. It's amazing that we finally are able to make this happen.
Very happy to be here. For the listener, of course, I'm here right now, and you don't know that we've been emailing about this for literally millions of years. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely started this in the Pleistocene, and we're getting to it now. Yeah, no, it's really exciting. I'm glad that you've stuck around, because I've had ping pong events with guests in the past, and it just ended up not working. So I'm very happy that you're here. I just also want to say that, if there's no backstory to this, there is going to be backstory now. So I learned about Mike through Matthew Broussard. Matthew Broussard was like, after him and I did our recording a while back, he was like, "Hey, this is a list of people that you should try to get on your show," and Mike was one of them. And then, of course, Dr. Kevin Hickerson was another one. So I'm excited to make this happen. So for this episode, it's definitely a mix-up from what normally goes on, because I don't have any background in what we're talking about today. So I'm going to be saying things that I've Googled and that I've read in a book, one book. So again, like, the Dunning-Kruger effect may be taken into account here, guys. So this is all about linguistics and philosophy. I mean, a very small portion of linguistics and a very small portion of philosophy. And we're catering the back half of this to philosophy of ethics. And then we'll have a slight discussion. I'm very excited to know what Mike has to say about free will versus determinism. I know it's a clickbaity, topic conversation, but I feel like with his background and my background, there might be some different things that will come to the surface. But for this segment, we're going to be talking about linguistics. And I want to start off by asking Mike if he has heard of Ludwig Wittgenstein and his famous statements about the limits of language.
Sure. I definitely came across Wittgenstein in my studies in both philosophy and linguistics. So I got an undergraduate degree in philosophy and psychology and a minor in linguistics. And then I got a graduate degree, a master's degree in linguistics. And I think it was probably in my philosophy classes more than in my linguistics classes that Wittgenstein arose. Though I did take, there's like some overlap. Like, I took a philosophy of math class that was both a math class and a philosophy class. There was an intro to cognitive science class. There was a psychology class and I think a linguistics class. And then there was definitely like a philosophy of language class, which was linguistics and philosophy. So I don't remember where I first came across Wittgenstein, but he was like, one of the major like philosophy of language, like linguistic philosophy guys, however long ago that was. And I remember he talked a lot about games and like that, kind of in some ways like everything is a game. I think that language is a
Oh,
game, communication is a game. And this is also now, I'm out of my degree program for 15 years at least, so I
don't date
don't
yourself, man.
I'm happy to be, one time I was performing stand-up comedy at a college, and I was doing some material about children and age and growth and learning, and I always like to ask people of all ages like how old they are and how old they wish they were. And I kind
Mm.
of had the idea that if they wished that they were the age that they were, I'd be like, I thought that was like the wisest answer, to be like, oh, to wish for what is like beautiful. But
Mm.
then this 19-year-old at a college once, he answered in a way that I was like, well, that's good too. He was like, I wish I was 50. And I was like, wow, why? And he said, because I want to be wise. And I'm like, wow,
Oh,
this kid
okay.
at 19, no, he's like, probably I'll know more when I'm 50. And so I'm 44 now, and I'm, very, very content to let people know how old I am, how long it's been since I've been in school, how long I've been since I've, been like learning the things that we're talking about. So and also while we were just talking, I was
Mm.
briefly finding the Wikipedia page for language game in parentheses philosophy, and it's just a brief quote. A language game is a philosophical concept developed by Ludwig Wittgenstein, referring
Oh.
to simple examples of language use and the actions into which the language is woven. So you
Mm.
can feel free to read the rest of that Wikipedia page on your own.
Yeah.
But the short answer to your question is yes, I'm familiar, at least broadly, with Wittgenstein.
Yeah, yeah. Well, way better than I am, but I would say, I guess, I saw a common theme come up where he said that language, paraphrasing, of course, language exists for the purpose of communication, and its function is to convey information. But you know, information can be lost in language, in that transformation of information, but also the interpretation of reality, because we use words to describe it in one way, shape, or form, whether we're writing it down or just speaking about it, freely. Things can be lost, and that has implications.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I feel like the word chair, might evoke in your mind a similar image than it does in my mind, but also like the very first, I think, paper that I had to write in a semantics class in my linguistics program was to define a chair. Like what defines a chair? Like what is the definition that captures everything that is a chair and nothing that isn't a chair? Because there are things that are very similar to chairs, like a couch is kind of like a chair, or a bench is kind of like a chair, or a stool is kind of like a chair, or like a high chair. Is a high chair a chair? Is a beanbag chair a chair? Yes, but it looks nothing like almost any other chair. So
Hmm.
it ends up being, I mean, from our teacher's guidance, like the combination of form and function that sort of makes a thing. But also, like we might look at the same thing and I'm like, that's a chair, and you might be like, no, I think that's more of like a love seat or a bench. Or if the more words you have for something, then perhaps the farther apart we might be in our understanding. Like for a language that only has two color words, you're like, that one's dark, that one's light. And then if you add in, dozens of other color words, and be like, oh, that one's magenta and that one's fuchsia, and that one's like teal and that one's puce. And then some people might just have, I got your basic 6 words, but sort of the one overall point. There's many points here. It's a multi-pointed point that I'm making, that like the word chair isn't a chair. Like a chair is a chair, and a thing
Hmm.
is a thing, and that words will almost never capture the thing that they're talking about. They'll only be like some sort of, approximation, some sort of like yeah, that gets the idea across. And like you said, depending on people's sort of individual lexicons or languages of origin, like
Hmm.
people, there's certain colors that if you look at it, like somebody's like, that's definitely purple, and somebody else might be like, that's definitely blue, because those words, it doesn't mean that they don't know what the words mean, but they might have a slightly different wavelength associated with the color in their mind, or they might actually perceive color slightly differently. Obviously some
Yeah.
people are colorblind in various ways. So yeah, I overall, yeah. And there's one other thing I mentioned to you before we started recording that I'll bring up now. There was a guy named Grice who came up with these maxims, the Gricean maxims, and they're basically about communication and how language works. So it's I think it's also called like the cooperative principle. And so the four maxims are one, the maxim of quantity, the maxim of quality, the maxim of relation, and the maxim of manner. And so basically, quantity is you try to be give as much information as needed, nothing more. There's like a web page that has Grice's maxims that I always just Google Grice's maxims and it pops up. It's from UPenn. The maxim of quality is where one tries to be truthful and doesn't give like false information.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like the way that regular communication generally works. And then the maxim of relation, where what you're saying is hopefully relevant. And then the maxim of manner, where you try to be clear and brief and orderly. And so an example is like, let's say you said to me, is Dave home? Let's say we both know a guy named Dave. Like you say, is Dave home? That probably means I know who Dave is. Like you're being like relevant, you're not giving more information than you need. If you were like, Dave, our mutual friend who we both talk about every day, you're not going to say that necessarily, because if we both have the common referent of Dave in our experience, you're like, is Dave home today? And then I might answer, well, I drove by and there is a green car outside his house. And that could be nonsense, or it could mean we both know that Dave has a green car, and or it could mean that we both know that Dave's greatest enemy has a green car and is sitting outside of his home waiting for. And so, obviously, it means something based, but it couldn't, under ordinary conversational circumstances, it would be weird if it meant nothing.
Right.
And in comedy, I feel like often like the Gricean maxims are sort of like bent and broken, like for comedic effect. Like here's a classic old joke. Like, do you know this one? How many months have 28 days?
Oh yeah, all of them.
Yeah, all of them. And like obviously in a regular conversation, if you say to somebody, hey, how many months have 28 days? They'd be like 1 February, obviously. But that you'd be a jerk if you doing it in a joke book, it's fun, but doing it in real life is jerky. So I feel like that those are, for the purposes of language, of course, exists, first and foremost for communication. And then I feel like as humans, we have evolved, socially to a point where now we do, we don't have to work all day necessarily, or maybe we do, or maybe we work differently now. The point
Depends
is
on the society you live in.
Yeah, exactly. Scratch that. The idea that like, I feel like language is not only for communication, or it's not only for the kind of communication that we think of as like communicating information, like lyrics in a song communicate something, but they're not necessarily about how to do something, or like, help me, like throw me a life preserver, throw me, like, help pull me out of this river. That's communication in one way, compared to like, oh, this music really speaks to me, is like communication in another way, though perhaps all communication in a way.
That's fair. I don't know why, but for some reason, I just kept like thinking back to whenever you were making the comparison of like when someone is thinking about like blue and purple. I don't know why, but I just kept thinking like this feels like along the lines of like the horrible conversation of like, is a hot dog a sandwich? Like, or no, sorry, about the chair. Whenever you're talking about is a beanbag chair a chair? Is it it's like a couch a chair? But it's like it's that same dilemma, and it's like
I love it. I went on a podcast once called The Sporkful that a friend of mine, Dan Patchman, runs, and it's all like food related. And I went on to have discussions with him about, I feel like is spaghetti with marinara sauce a salad? Is a taco a sandwich? And he's like, somebody's gonna argue one, somebody's gonna argue the other, and like, the simple answer, like it depends on what frame you're looking at it in, right? Like, because the answer is it depends based on your definition. And I think that's the interesting thing that can come out of this is like, of course it depends on your definition. Like, and so if your definition is such that it rules in something that you don't want to rule in, then maybe you need to change your definition so that it doesn't, or maybe you can accept that at the fringes. I mean, of course, it's always going to be that at the fringes, like there'll be things that are, maybe this is another great lesson in like, in like the non-binary, that things are not necessarily like black. Is this black? Is this white? Well, what about this one? Oh, there's some gray area in between.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we know it with age. We're knowing it more these days with gender, with
Mm-hmm.
race, of course. Like it isn't just that there's absolute concrete. This is this, and that is that. And so it's like sandwich, non-sandwich. Like I feel like it'd be a funny image to imagine, like, definitely a sandwich, two pieces of bread and something in between. That's your classic archetype of sandwich. And at the other end, you have like, completely disparate, like no bread at all and just like things like strewn about, like a deconstructed mess of garbage. But then you could create, like an evolutionary, trail between them and be like, oh, right in the middle, like maybe a taco's in the middle. Certainly, a taco is more a sandwich than a salad that has no bread or starch or anything in it, right?
Yeah.
And a hot dog similarly. Hot dog, and so that's I had this woman on my podcast once whose name is Ashton Applewhite, and she is an anti-ageism activist. And she helped teach with. She also created the Truly Tasteless Joke Books series from that I like grew up with in the 80s. And
Cool.
but she was the first person to like share with me this concept that I'm like, of course, this makes complete sense that there is not just young and old. When you're 5 years old, a 6-year-old could be old. When you're 10, a
Yeah.
20-year-old. When you're 30, a 50-year-old. Whatever it is. And my mom, she's in her 70s now, and sometimes if somebody like a friend, somebody she knows dies at 83, she'll be like, so young. It's of course relative. And
Yeah.
so Ashton introduced me to the concept of like, so it's not that ageism is, discrimination against old people or young people. It's discrimination against the older or the younger, that it's relational, that it's older or younger. Like, I believe that I'm older than you, you're younger than me, but it doesn't mean that you're young and I'm old, because those absolutes don't have any don't you need somewhere to ground them. How tall
Yeah.
are you? Well, compared to a little dog or a mountain. How fast are you going compared to a snail or compared to a comet?
Mm-hmm.
Or light. And so I feel like, this is all to say, are you sandwicher or less sandwich? Are you more sandwichy or less sandwichy? And I would say that, yeah, hot dog and taco are more sandwichy than some things and less sandwichy than
And other
if you
things. Yeah.
say, imagine a sandwich, and people picture the ideal, the platonic form of a sandwich. And they're like, well, a hot dog isn't that. They're less sandwich than that. But you don't. And if you make an artificial, you have to say yes or no, this or that. Which one is it? Then I mean that is where it can become irritating.
Understood. And
Yeah.
and two great points, I think. Two simplistic points is like words are used with like the relativity of wrong, and then also I think it's like based on the conversation. Like if we're having the conversation, the philosophical conversation of what is a sandwich, fine. The spectrum can be pretty broad, but like if I'm just trying to order a hot dog at the store, I'm not going to go, "Hey man, can you get me a sandwich? I want a hot
Yes.
dog."
Yeah.
Like it's definitely circumstantial. you know,
Absolutely.
yeah, there's a bit of reductionism in this where it's like it makes sense to be binary in certain situations, but then there are certain situations that it's like it's okay to like discuss on a spectrum or like have a word lie on a spectrum.
Yeah, I remember this. I think this also came up in one of my linguistics classes. Like some public parks might have a sign up that says no motorized vehicles, right? They don't want motorized vehicles in there. And then somebody's like, what about a motorized wheelchair? Is that technically is a motorized wheelchair? And they're like, yeah, we're okay with wheelchairs. If your wheelchair is motorized, we just don't want like, kids on like, motorized scooters zooming through. We want
Hmm.
motorcycles. We don't want cars driving through. And so I feel like you can always start from like the intent is important, and perhaps the
Yeah.
intent is more important, like the spirit of the law more than the letter of the law. Though, of course, linguistics, I feel like is about examining the spirit and the letter of the law, and how can hopefully, the letter support the spirit, and maybe vice versa.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So we've really built up to this
Mhm.
point. And I think it would be good if I just got like an overview, if you could, of linguistics. Like give me the 5-minute version of what you think linguistics breaks down into.
Sure, of course. So I'll
Doesn't have
start
to be
with
5 minutes though. Sorry.
yeah, it'll be however long it is, but yeah, clock me. So the very first linguistics class that I took, I always forget whether it was called like the grammar of English or the structure of grammar. And so I'll start by talking about what linguistics isn't. I mean, it is the study of language. And what does that mean? I remember I fell in love with it because my professor Joan Mailing taught in this first class. Like one of the first things she said was, she's like, I don't care if you split infinitives. I don't care if you use, a preposition at the end of a sentence. I don't care if you say ain't or spell things wrong. It's like, that's not what linguistics is concerned with. Linguistics is, I learned, is not concerned with it's not concerned with prescribing how people should speak. It's about describing how people do speak, and that breaks down into like the various classes that I took. Sort of I think the core classes that everyone who studied linguistics at Boston University, where I got my master's degree, like studied. Like you had your basic classes were, well, what is language? At the very root of it, it's made of sounds. So I took my first one basic class was called like phonetics and phonology. So phonetics is like the study of the actual like acoustics of like the sounds that are being produced by, if it's a spoken language, the mouth, and maybe other parts, the all the teeth, the tongue, the glottis, the various. So we studied, how are these sounds made? What sounds exist in what languages? Some languages have a th, some languages don't. English is one of the only ones with a th, which is why sometimes, if the classic, stereotype of a French accent is like this or that, because they don't have a th in their language. And then, I mean, in our language, we have one B sound and one P sound. And I believe in Korean, they have like multiple Bs. They have like, there's one that could be like breath or voiced, and one that's not voiced, or one that's aspirated, or one that's not aspirated. And so there's all these different ways that the sounds can be manifested. And so that's phonetics. And then phonology is like sort of the study of that. So for every phone or sound that comes out of our mouth, there's some phoneme in our head, and that is like our mental representation of the sound. So like in actuality, here's an interesting thing. The word pit and spit, one is PIT, one is SPIT. It seems like it's the same P, but it is the same P phoneme wise, I believe. In our head, we're like, that's a P, but as it comes out, it's a different phone. Because if you think about spit, and then if you take the S off of it, and you can do this like, electronically, you could record yourself saying the word spit. It actually turns out that it's more spit. The P in spit is more like our B in bit. It's more spit and not spit, because we're not saying like pit is aspirated, I believe. And so pit, there's like different levels of like, sort of, you learn, I forget which level at which, the things, you learn like Freud when you start learning about psychology, and you're like, okay, this is what he said, and here's everything he got wrong. And then with linguistics, you're like, here's what Chomsky said, sort of like the Freud of linguistics, and here's everything he got wrong. And like you start with noun phrases, then you're like, it's actually a determiner phrase, whatever it is. But so on one level, pit is aspirated, we're like pit, and bit is not aspirated, bit. And then so spit has S, and then the non-aspirated the bit, but we think of it as a P because we spell it with a P, but that's just something that happens between our brain and it coming out of our mouth, because maybe it's harder for us to say spit, like that's weird to take a stop and make that aspirated. So that's like the interaction of phonetics and phonology. And like, for example, in certain Asian languages, we think of sometimes the R and the L sound, like they might come out like one time when we might say an R, they say an L, or vice versa. And the reason for that is in some languages, the R and the L are two different manifestations, phonetic manifestations of one phoneme. There's one phoneme in their head that's like, sometimes it comes out as R, sometimes it comes out as L. And so it just happens systematically. And like, same thing for us. If we were trying to pronounce a Korean word with sounds that don't exist in our native language, we would sound, to them like they sound to us, for example. So that's phonetics and phonology. Then those sounds, combine into meaningful units that are, I would say, called, I didn't come up with the name, morphemes as sort of the next level. And so the study of morphology which is kind of the only like of those words. We're familiar with phonetics. There's going to be 4 different levels, and all of them are words that are generally, I think, colloquially used, except for morphemes are not like a thing that we have a concept for. But it's not that they just combine into words, because sometimes a morpheme is a word, like dog is a morpheme and dog is a word. Doghouse is a word made of 2 morphemes, dog and house. And house, of course, can be its own word. Sometimes there are morphemes that cannot exist on their own outside of a word, like adverbial endings, like -ly is a morpheme, or ing is a morpheme, but it's not a full word. Or even like cran, like maybe is cran a word? We can get into like the sandwich question. Like cranberry is a word made of the morphemes cran and berry, and cran means something. It has, so a morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of language. Like, and it's interesting too, because sometimes even phonemes or phones could seem like they have meaning, because like there's some words like, I don't know, snooze and schnoz and sneeze. I'm like, oh, does sn, they all have something to do with the nose. Like, does sn mean nose? Maybe, kind of, but I wouldn't say that sn is itself a morpheme, but maybe that's a question that's been researched more since I left my degree program. But definitely the smallest unit that could sort of, exist and be recognizable as meaningful, that is a morpheme. And then morphemes combine into words or are words themselves. And then those words combine into sentences. And then the next level up is syntax, where like, when I was in 2nd grade, I remember learning how to like diagram sentences for the first time. And I was like, this really speaks to me. Like, for whatever reason, like I have a math brain, and like the math of English, like, which is, I feel like that is what linguistics, or some parts of linguistics are. And so, you learn in syntax the way that different languages, order sentences, order words. Like, I think for every sentence in most languages, there's going to be some either explicit or implicit subject, verb, and possibly object. And in English, the order usually goes subject, verb, object. The person does the thing. And then in some languages, so there's subject, verb, object, and then there's 6 possibilities for the order that could happen with SVO. And I think there's only one that's very uncommon. I forget which one it is, but it's like maybe one of the ones starting with object for whatever reason. Like it might be object, verb, sentence, or object, verb, subject, or object, subject, verb. I think that one's probably, I forget which, but one of them is like not super common, but all the other ones kind of like exist in reasonable proportion, like throughout language. Like there's no reason why any one of them like is any more effective or efficient than any others. It's just like, you learn what the people speak around you, and you're like, oh, that's what we do. The subject goes here, the verb goes here, the object goes here. And then the final level above that, I would say, is semantics, which is where basically you could have a sentence, and what does it mean? Like semantics is where sort of like meaning is gleaned, because you could have the same exact sentence, but with a different tone or with a different context, it might not mean the same thing. So I feel like I mean, if it was like there could be even without a question mark at the end, like going to the pool, like one is like the same words, the same syntax, like the same subject, object, verb relation, like we go into the pool. And so obviously there's sometimes speaking informally might be different than, if you wrote it down. But and also I'll just throw in a brief plug for I believe her name is Gretchen McCulloch, is a linguist who wrote a book called Because Internet. And it involves lots of analyses of the way that these days, like this is the first time in history that we have like such a trove of examples of not only like formal writing, formal language, formal speech, which is like, from the time of Shakespeare, from the time of, Chaucer and Old English and any language, most of the records that we have going back hundreds of years are from like, their church documents, or their like formal, like the Constitution or the Magna Carta, or, only the things that the royal educated, the very few people knew how to read for a long time. So there wasn't a lot of like, there weren't a lot of postcards, going back. And even today, now we've got, examples of like texts, and G chats, and there's so much data that exists. So people can now like analyze the informal language, and because that's most of what language is informal language. Most of language is spoken, not written. Most of language is, verbal communication. And that's something that we don't have access to, cross culturally, going back too far. So anyway, so those I would say those are the basics. The basic building blocks of linguistics are like phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and then of course on
Mhm.
top of that, there's many other, like there's sociolinguistics, there's historical linguistics, there's other classes and focuses that people can have. But that was sort of the basics from my studies.
Okay, no, that was really good. It was over 5 minutes, but I
Okay,
think it was necessary, and that
thank
was
you.
no, that was lovely. Two things though, and very interesting that like stands out to me. Not really stands out that like I wasn't aware of it,
Sure.
but like good to point out that like if you're not bilingual or you don't study other languages or say you might not even read like manga for some reason, you won't know that like the structure of sentences changes based on different languages. Like for
Yes.
example, the way that like Japanese versus like English is structured is completely different. But
Yes.
like you said, it's just based on those like six available
Configurations.
possibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, configurations. Yeah, that's really cool. I think that's really good. I mean, I really like I can't really add any more on there because like I said, then it'll be like the Dunning-Kruger effect and I'll just have to show myself out. But no, that's cool. So with all that being said, we've played around with the fact that language does carry a sense of information can be lost and it is based on interpretation and there's a relativity of wrong in terms of who you're communicating with, etc. So what are some possibilities, what are some problems that could arise because of the faults in language or the faults in the faults in
Sure.
language?
Well, I guess I'll start by answering the first question that you edited briefly mid question. Why does it matter? I mean, I do feel like the question of why it matters, like why does anything matter? Again, it's sort of
Yeah.
context and definition dependent. But like any scientific or social scientific examination, like I mean, I think that communication, that language is one of the main things. Like I used to have a joke where I would say language is the only thing that separates us from the mimes. But uh truly that we're the only we're the only beings that communicate the way that we do. Of course, we're learning more now actually, and AI I
Hmm.
think is helping like learn to decipher dolphin or whale communications and
Yeah.
bees and such as well. So obviously other animals are communicating, but this is, I think that without comparing ourselves to other creatures, it is like language really helped advance, human like social evolution.
Yeah.
Because when you could communicate with somebody, when you're going out, I don't know, trying to take down a woolly mammoth, or like having more than just grunts, more than just looks, more than just
Yeah.
nonverbal communication. Like that was something. And having words to identify, like, hey, that one's poisonous, like don't eat that one, like rather than just like or whatever people were doing before language existed. They probably had ways,
Yeah.
but so I think that the study of how that all happens, like how does this mechanism work? How did we acquire it? What is language? And so yeah, I mean, I feel like it's fascinating, and on a theoretical, on a philosophical level, but then also on a practical level. I did work for, while I was in grad school, I worked at a technology company. I worked in the speech and language department, and part of what we were doing was like essentially training robots how to process language, like training computer models to understand what names were, what questions were, what things were. So sorry everybody, it wasn't all my fault, but uh and so I feel like that is something that now there is like voice recognition technology that is much more advanced
Hmm.
than it used to be. And obviously, for better or worse, like tools online that help us answer questions or learn things, and connect us to other people in
Hmm.
ways to do translation with people like who don't speak the same language
Yeah.
that we do. And I guess probably that's getting into like the challenges that are offered, as you were leaning towards as well.
Yeah, but I
Uh,
think I can also intervene and say like
Please.
and you definitely were getting there. It's like today, like more than even like in the past where we were just in hunter gatherer tribes, we're mixing cultures and having to collaborate. Like our best work is done whenever we collaborate with other people that look at things through a different lens. And studying linguistics and understanding linguistics and is such a big thing for us. We have to have that in society. That way we can kind of have a mesh and, you know, again, collaborate and also just understand other people and where they're coming from.
Absolutely. And like there, you know, every once in a while you see like a listicle online that's like, look at these 14 words that don't exist in English, but that really speak to a resonant concept in people's like, why don't we have these words? Like, even whether it's, you know, wabi sabi, you know, or like a word that talks about, I don't know, having more books than like buying books but not reading them. You know, there's just
Mm-hmm.
these resonant ideas that, of course, like, you know, we grow up with only our own conscious experience that we're directly knowing, but then we can, you know, we can listen to other people who have grown up in different circumstances, people of different ages, people of different, you know, obviously cultures, and then people who, you know, grew up completely with different languages that they might, you know, have you heard of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis?
No.
So did you see the movie Arrival?
Yes. Of
So
course.
the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is at play in the movie Arrival in a way that, in my recollection of like learning about it in my linguistic studies, was like the basic hypothesis was like that if you have a word for something, then you see it more than if you don't, then you, or you experience it more than if you don't. And if you don't have a word for it, like the idea that there's certain languages only have like a very few color words. Some only have two color words. And so the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis hypothesizes like maybe they don't see color the same way that other people who have more words for colors see color. I think that 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 theory has been like debunked in its, you know, sort of extreme form, that to say like just because if I have, you know, if some language has, you know, multiple words for like red, pink, purple, you know, somewhere along that spectrum, and we only have one or two of those words, like I think the human eye can still differentiate and be like, well, that's a lighter pink, that's a darker pink. You know,
Yeah.
we have hundreds of thousands of shades that we can, you know, I think identify, that we don't have words for all of them, but it gets to be like that one's lighter, that one's darker. These are different if we look at them side by side.
Yeah. And it
Um,
could be that that culture just really doesn't care about describing colors via words. And yet maybe compared to the culture that you know, were raised in, they care more about something that you care less of. And
yes,
that
and that,
doesn't
yeah,
and it's like a if you consider that theory as being credible, it could be a slippery slope for many reasons.
absolutely. And so I have a friend who is a comedian named Erin Judge, and one of her first jokes, she's super funny. I love her a lot, very dear friend. One of her earliest jokes that she would tell, she would say, "I'm bisexual," which for those that don't know means you're my type. And I mean, even the word bisexual itself has come to potentially mean different things when it, you know, because bisexual sort of originally, I think, depended on the gender binary to be like, oh, I like this gender and that gender. Though nowadays, some people might interpret it to mean, oh, I'm attracted to my gender and genders that are not mine. And so it could be like bisexual could be a synonym for pansexual. Just I'm
Mm,
open to any gender. And so my friend Erin told me very specifically once, she was like, that the idea of being attracted to different genders wasn't even how she like initially, like if she came up with the language, it might have been different, because she's like, I might be attracted to people of different cultures, people of different races, people of different ages, but I don't have a word for my identity that says, oh, yeah, I'm attracted to this kind of person and that kind of person, this kind of person and that kind of person. And she's like, for gender, it's kind of like that for me. I'm like, gender just like isn't one of the filters through which she looks at people to assess whether she's attracted to them. And so I feel
mhm.
like, you know, if she had a society built around that concept, then, you know, the concept of the language of gender identity or of sexual orientation might have arisen in a different way. And perhaps there are other cultures that wherein it does arise in different ways. I haven't fully researched it.
That's interesting. The aspect of where or like your social implications of how, you know, it builds your knowledge, I guess, in your own language, but then also it's like the mind body problem isn't really a thing. It's that's been debunked more for like the genetic slash social implication of things, and with the way that we formalize how we communicate heavily relies on both of those aspects, and your social implications is it plays a huge role. You know, where you grow
Absolutely.
up, who you have friends with, who you talk to. You know, do you go to university? Do you travel? You know, are you in an open family? You know, all those things matters in how you interpret language.
Yeah, and there's like a famous study that talks about the sort of how class and language interact. Must have been maybe the 60s, give or take a decade. I'm not positive when it was, but it's like a famous study that I believe people went into experiments went into three different department stores of like that of varying like expense level. Like I think
Mm,
at the high end store they went into was maybe Saks Fifth Avenue. The mid range was maybe Macy's, and then that kind of department store, and the lower price point end was Woolworth. And they went in, and these were all like big department stores, and the experimenters would find people and ask them, "Hey, where can I find this item?" And they would always ask for something that was found on the fourth floor, and they were basically essentially testing how people pronounced fourth floor. And I believe they found that, when perhaps the price point was lower, people were less likely to pronounce the R. The idea that like they would say like fourth floor, in a way that if you're at Saks Fifth Avenue, they would enunciate the R very meticulously. They'd be like fourth floor. And sometimes I think even if they're like, oh, could you say that again? Or say, what was that again? And then if they asked a second time, then the people at Woolworths would be more likely to be like, oh, the fourth floor. Like they would enunciate it more, but like sort of their natural pronunciation of it was fourth floor, which is sometimes in America seen as like a lower class. Like there might be like judgments associated with the way that a person speaks, like whether it's a certain kind of New York accent or a Boston accent.
mm,
But it's interesting because in one way, because like it's also very similar to a British accent that we might view as posh and elegant. Be like, oh, the fourth floor, like
mm,
phonetically, acoustically, like it could be identical, yet based on the social context, that accent might be seen like one way as like lower class in the United States versus higher class in the UK. And I mean, it's hard to even sometimes to speak about these concepts. Like low class itself sort of has the word has connotations of like I feel like of judgment,
mm.
of the idea
Yeah.
that it's which I think is sort of baked into our capitalistic society, the idea that that more money is better, and that there can be some ethical assessment of like that it's somehow that if you don't have more money, then it is your fault somehow that you should have, that you didn't do the right thing, that which is nonsense, because so many things are based on so many people who are millionaires like started that way, and so many people who don't started that way, and like it's there's an unfair playing field. And of course there are anomalous stories of people beginning their life with little money and ending it with lots of money, but I feel like empirically that is not the standard experience across the board.
No, they need to. They also need to read The Great Gatsby. Just saying.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So there's this bias, right? I mean, that's what I'm getting out of this.
Yes.
There's an unfortunate language bias. How do we break that? What
I mean,
obviously studying linguistics.
yeah, I think like studying is an important thing. I mean,
Mm,
interrogating our own experience, like on an
yeah,
individual level, like questioning, like, what we believe and why we believe it. And I think the answer is you sort of alluded to it or directly stated it earlier. It's, learning from people who are different than us,
yeah.
learning about other people's experiences. Like I remember, like, I grew up my parents were teachers. I would say we were middle class, it's also really interesting when I was just in the UK for the Edinburgh Fringe Fest, and I was in Scotland for a month and in England for a week or two before that. And class is such an interesting topic over there, like that I think is more overtly discussed, like than, and there's sort of more, and maybe it's because I don't know what the racial diversity makeup of the states compared to the UK is, but I mean I'm sure it's different, and so perhaps where where we have a racial caste system, historically, like maybe they have a class-based caste system.
Hmm.
And I'm certainly not an expert in this, but I remember when I'm there, they speak about class like much more than they speak about like religion or
Hmm.
other topics that are like much more commonly discussed here. But so this is all to say, yeah, we can. So oh yeah, when I started doing comedy, I remember. So I was raised, just like in a suburb of like in New Jersey, outside of New York City, by like a half hour, an hour, and we had enough food. We had enough. Like I was very fortunate, very grateful. Like we didn't have a mansion, but I never went hungry. And I remember, and everyone that I went to like high school with, I would say the majority of people went to college. That was just one of the parts of the culture that I was like raised in. I was like, oh yeah, that's what you do. You go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, you have family, you die, whatever. And and that's an important part of it. And I remember when I started doing comedy, I started meeting people who like didn't go to college, didn't graduate college, maybe didn't graduate high school. Found out about, I don't know, people like Doug Stanhope, who I think is a genius comedian, like didn't have the same level of education that I think he might. I don't know if he I actually don't know what level he made to beyond high school, if that. George Carlin, I feel like, was another person who one of the smartest humans, one of the smartest comedians for sure. Similarly, like educate, like school-based education wasn't the thing that made him who he was. And so I remember meeting people who I thought were like super smart comedians who I learned didn't their family, their culture, their wherever they grew up, like they individually didn't have the same parameters as my family did, as my where I grew up did. And so that was like you know super illuminating, because I was like, wait, but I thought, don't smart, on a very very reductive way, I was like, don't smart people go to college? Like, isn't that what they do? And like eventually I was like, man, if I knew that I wanted to be a comedian before I went to college, I could have saved a lot of money. And that's what a lot of my friends who didn't go to college, they're like, oh, I want to be a comedian, I'm going to go to a city, start doing open mics, and start really like living the life of my dreams. Without, I mean, I loved my college experience, I loved learning everything that I did, but I also think about the scene in Good Will Hunting where he talks to the Harvard guy about how you could get that same education. Like the books exist,
Hmm. Hmm.
especially today, the information, the internet, it's
Yeah.
so much of it is out there. And so that was like a real paradigm shift for me, was meeting people of different cultural, educational, class backgrounds. And so I mean, that's certainly something that I don't know if there's one size fits all answer to how can we eliminate our biases, but certainly meeting people or reading books by, or taking in the art of like human
Hmm.
beings who if you were born in America, learn about the immigrant experience. If you were, you can always learn from people who are older than you or younger than you, or who grew up in a different place, or who speak a different way. And to know that, obviously, like if somebody speaks with a strong accent, it doesn't mean, I mean, number one, if somebody comes to the States, like there's a comedian named Joe Wong who started out around when I did, and he's so funny and brilliant. And he had a very, he was born in China. He had a very strong accent that he spoke English with. And also, like, how good is my Chinese? How good is my Mandarin or Cantonese? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
he he does comedy now in both languages. He's fluent in English and in his native language, and like, and I feel like that there's so many like context based judgments that we, until we explicitly think about them and look at them, we're
Hmm.
like, the idea of the bigot who's like, you're gonna come here, learn English. I'm like, so many people do come here, do learn English, and also can converse with so many more people around the world and learn so many. There's so much we can
Hmm.
learn from people who speak more languages than we do.
Oh yeah. And just a quick testimony, I guess, before we run out of this segment, because I thought it'd be fun to add it. So if I'm sure most of the listeners know that I'm actually living in Tel Aviv, Israel, and since being here, I think one of the I think there's a lot of positives to living here, but the one that I would probably rank the highest is being able to communicate with people who speak in different languages. Like in the team of structural engineers that we have, all of them speak three languages. I'm pretty sure, between French, Arabic, Hebrew, English, Portuguese. Yeah, so like it's a mix, and it's impressive. But one of the fun challenges that makes it even more like that separates itself from the other like benefits of living here is the fact that like whenever we're trying to perform these tasks, they'll come to me and be like, Sam, check my English, or what does this mean? Or should I use this word? And in my life, I have never had to do that outside of like an English course. So it's like, I've never really thought about why I say this word in this, like
Hmm.
why do I use this syntax? Why is the semantics this way? And it's really cool. And it like kind of brings the whole full circle of like just like common education in the United States, and then also the beauty of just being submersed with people that are completely different from you. So it's a cool perspective, and I think everyone should at least try to converse with people who aren't just speaking English. Go out and speak with someone else. It's fun.
Yeah.
It's challenging but fun.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like learning another language, learning anything,
Of course.
learn, just learn on your own, learn with other people, like do what you can and do what you want.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're gonna cut this. This actually ran a lot longer than I thought for segment one, which
Understood.
totally cool.
Yeah.
This was awesome. But whenever we come back, we're going to, I think, mash our ethics conversation, and then we'll get out of here. So stick around. All right, we're back, and this is going to be a condensed version of the podcast, just because the first segment kind of ran a little longer than we expected, and honestly, it was great. I thought it was a good back and forth, and Mike did a fantastic job explaining things.
Thank
Whenever I don't have to say much,
you.
that means the guest is doing an awesome job. So, or it's also the fact that I don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm okay with saying that.
Can it be both? Thank you for listening, everyone. Yeah.
So for segment two, what we talked about offset is we're going to shrink down the whole philosophy of ethics. We were going to cover a lot of schools of thought, but we felt like if we were just going to address or kind of discuss the dilemmas that are kind of open-ended still in ethical philosophy, then we would end up inevitably talking about some of the schools of thought. So we're just going to do it that way, and it's
Yeah.
probably better for you anyways.
I'll just briefly, the two main schools of thought that I learned about in my first ethics classes were utilitarianism and Kantianism, is what I learned, sort of calling it utilitarian. We've all heard of it for the most part. The doing the most good for the most people, just having the best consequences. And then Kant, weird that consequences sort of starts with Kant, consequences. Now for the Kant sequences, he was basically like, no, you don't want to think about the outcome. You want to think about the action and make sure the action is something that you'd like will everyone to do, because sometimes if everyone just does the other thing, then it's like, then there'd be chaos. And so that, I feel like that brief summation is in a utilitarian way helpful to decrease the suffering and increase the joy for all of our listeners.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of fun stipulations out there with the schools of thought, and it's fun because whenever you just like read different like scripts from philosophers in the past, they'll beat up like stoicism, and then they'll be like, well, I live in the camp of consequentialism, and I'm a utilitarianist. It's like, but then there's holes in that one too. It's just subjective views, of course. But yes, so whenever we get through the open-ended dilemmas, we'll then have a quick discussion, as quick as Mike would want, about determinism versus free will. So that'll be fun. So let's dive into it. The first one that we have on the list is the trolley problem, and
Yes.
I'll briefly define it, and then I'll hand it over to Mike, and then I might give my 2 cents, but whatever. Do you really want to
Yeah.
hear my 2 cents? Paraphrasing just a little bit, that you're conducting a train and you're heading along a track and something bad happens. Inevitably, there's a split in the rail, and no matter which way you end up taking at the split, you're either going to kill, I guess I can say kill here, it's fine, kill 5 workers, 5 individuals, or change to the other track, the other lane, and kill only one rail worker. So, Mike, do you want to expand on that? Maybe I didn't explain that completely correct.
Yeah, I think the idea is that obviously on one level, on a utilitarian level, it seems like killing one person dying is better than 5 people dying. But part of I think, the trick of the problem is that in order to have that better option, you have to take action. So
Mm-hmm.
would you rather actively cause one death or passively allow 5 deaths?
Yeah.
And then I remember hearing like, and I think a lot of people are like, we should definitely do the one death. And obviously, as we're just talking about it. Glad we're not. I have a joke about how I am vegan. Look how long I went without telling you, though I might have already. But
First
and
time.
as a vegan, I think about sometimes people become vegan for different reasons. Some people are like, maybe it's healthier for me. People are like, I'm gonna live a more plant-filled, vegetable-filled life.
Yeah.
Some people are like, I'm thinking about the environment, like the planet. Like if many people, if many more people became plant-based eaters, like then the resources that are going into cattle would be more suitably put, and like it would be a vast, like the carbon footprint would vastly decrease. And so if
Yeah.
you care about the whole planet, you're like, well, that's a reason to become vegan as well. And then, I mean, the reason that I became vegan was when I learned, I always knew, but I learned more about, factory farms and the way that animals are treated, and
Yeah.
that it's horrendous. And even if animals are treated nicely, which mostly they're not, like most of the animals in the the meat system, the dairy system these days, there's a bunch of unnecessary suffering, and I'm like, I'd rather not be a part of as much unnecessary suffering as I can. So that is my care for the animals. So in a way, I feel like there's a trolley problem where we're on a track heading for all of the animals, the entire planet, and our own health potentially. We're on the track, the animals are on the track, the whole world is on the track, and we're like, well, what would you rather do? Should we keep it heading towards that track, or should we become vegan and turn the track towards, oh, nobody gets killed over here? Obviously, there's still pain and suffering that exist in the world, but people are like, but if we keep going this way, I still get cheese anyway. So that's I think a vegan update of the trolley problem. But here's something that I heard years ago, like, because it seems obvious if you're like just on a numbers basis, if you're going by numbers, like only have one person die, don't have 5 people die. But then you could ask this question: if a healthy person walks into a doctor's office and they have 2 kidneys, 2 lungs, and a heart, that that there's 5 people waiting for. Somebody's waiting for a kidney, they'll die without it. Somebody's waiting for a heart, they'll die without it. Somebody's waiting for the other kidney, then the 2 lungs. And they're like, well, is it not the same calculus to passively let 5 people die or actively cause one death so that those other 5 people could live? And that is, I think, a much more compelling, tweak to the trolley problem, where for most of the people, for anyone who said, yeah, save the 5 people, let the help the one person die, cause the one death, save the 5, I feel like many people would change their tune, because it's not only a logical calculus. There's also this what society do we want to live in, and perhaps that does shift us back and forth between the pure extreme utilitarian view and the more Kantian view. Because when it's so interesting, because they're both thought experiments. Neither of them are actually happening to me right now. I'm not in charge of who lives and dies in this way, thankfully. But I still, I feel more comfortable. It seems more removed, like a trolley. Yeah. Trolley, the one person, save those 5. Tra la 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 la. We did it. But but to even say like, yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine wanting to live in a society where like if you're healthy and you go to the doctor, they could be like, we need your organs now. And I mean, maybe that would, here's the thing is there's so many implications, then like, okay, well then maybe that healthy people would stop going to the doctor, and then people would die sooner because they're not found at, like diseases aren't found, and like
Hmm.
society could crumble in that way. So yeah, I think that manifestation of the trolley problem, I think, really gets to like the intent of it, to be like, what kind of world do we want to live in writ large? Like, true, I mean, we live in a society with laws. What do we want those laws to be? Like, there's actually, I read a book by Peter Singer, who was one of the first like ethical philosophers I was familiar with, who wrote Animal Liberation and books about rethinking life and death, about euthanasia and abortion and all kinds of things.
Hmm.
And he had this one book about effective altruism called, I think it's called like The Most Good You Can Do. And it starts with a story about like if you're walking near a pond and you see a child drowning in it and you're the only one around, you'll probably run in the pond and save that drowning child, even if it ruins your clothes that cost hundreds of dollars. And yet also there's children dying all over the world that hundreds of dollars would help not die, and we don't take that action because when it's in front of our face it seems more immediate. And there, in that book, he talks about how I think it's maybe Austria and Germany are two very similar civilizations, similar societies. And one of them, like in our system in America, the United States organ donation is opt-in. Like, you get a driver's license. They're like, do you want to be an organ donor? You can say yes or no. The default is you're not.
Hmm.
The default is, you keep your organs, and you have to choose to be like, yes, I would like to donate my organs. In Germany and Austria, I forget which is which, or whatever the countries are that he talked about, one country is opt in and the other is opt out. And
Okay.
that structure makes it so in both cases, people go with the default 70% of the time. So in the one where it's opt in, people mostly aren't organ donors. 30% of people are like, yeah, I think that would be a good thing to do. But in the one where it's opt out, people are like, yeah, what we do here, we're organ donors. That's what we do.
Mm.
And but if some people are like, nah, I don't want you to have my organs, that's fine. That's allowed. But it's such an interesting thing because it seems like why wouldn't it be even if people are making like the rational logical choice of like, is it good or is it bad? Is it, do I want it or do I not want it? But that's clearly like the context, the cultural context of where you're starting from is very relevant. And so this is all to say, I think we all should be organ donors wherever you live. I
Yeah.
think that would be a good thing. And it's funny because sometimes people then worry, they're like, well, what if I get into an accident and the doctor sees that I'm an organ donor? Will they try to save me less? Like, and it becomes like, another morphing of that. I feel like there are people who worry. They're like, if there's me and another guy and they could save me or him, and, and these kind of, like ticking bomb kind
Mm.
of type, thought experiments arise. I'm like, good news, most of us are not going to be in any of these like worst case scenario situations. But I mean, I think that it is a good thought experiment to think like,
Hmm.
but I don't have the answer. But that's the question is like, how do we want to live our life? Like, it's sort of like the wave particle duality. Like, we are both. That like every individual situation we're in is our life, and also like the wave of, like what kind of society do we live in? And that's like utilitarian is like, what's the best thing for this moment right now? What can we foresee? What consequences from this action? And then Kant is like, what can we foresee if everyone did the action that you're talking about, and then trying to game it. And we're flawed, imperfect, beings that don't have complete, we don't have bet even 2020 hindsight, really. They say it, but certainly we don't have 2020 foresight. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, or what, but we do our best. So we do our best to figure out like, what's the best thing I can do right now that also hopefully would be the best if every reasonable person did this as well. And I think
Yeah.
it's, yeah, run over the one guy, but don't kill the guy at the doctor.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a couple other ways that you can take this other than just like the Kantianism, and utilitarianism is like, obviously you can take it as relativism, where everyone has their own subjective view and will probably do what they feel is right and wrong with social or societal implications to that. Then there's also the objectivism where you could just take the stance of, well, I'm going to go with whatever is naturally right, no matter what the divine or the individual tells me. Whatever happens is the right course of action. It's almost like it to me. It feels almost like a naturalist like way of thinking. It's like, well, how whatever nature's intending for this whatever's going to
And
happen. It's like outcome driven kind of.
yeah,
So it is kind of more Kantiism, but
and that one, that also I feel like, edges onto into the determinism versus free will discussion, because like what does nature, whatever nature wants or intends, like we're part of nature. So I feel like that is also sort of like,
yeah,
offloading some of the, if there is personal, if you believe that in any context there is personal responsibility, then I think that that's a bit of a cop out.
it is a cop out just so they don't have to think about it after it happens. It's kind of like and then the last it also kind of ties in with what I'm about to say is it's like, well, let's just say you're looking out for number one and you're like, well, if I don't touch the lever to change to hit that one person, I never made that conscious decision to kill that one person. And also, if for some reason I am asked in a court of law, I never changed anything to make that person die.
Mhm.
What happened. I can say, well, I was in the back and I didn't see what happened till after the fact. you know but it's like there's like some denialism going on
Oh
there.
yeah,
Yeah.
this sort of, I don't mean to get us too far afield, but I have a good friend who's a practicing Buddhist, and so I've been learning a lot about Buddhism,
Mm,
and I like it a lot. And part of one of the main tenets, one of the main ideas in Buddhism is that most Buddhists, if not all Buddhists, would say that we all want, well, the goal is to the increase of happiness and the roots of happiness, and the decrease of suffering and the roots of
yeah.
suffering for all sentient beings.
Hmm.
And that's what most people want on an individual level, and that's what most beings want, that for themselves. And then as you hopefully expand that zone of being like, oh yeah, it'd be, of course it'd be great if it was so, happiness for all, no like limited, less suffering, more happiness for all, absolutely.
Hmm.
And there's a, they don't have a 10 commandments, but they do have 10 things that are like kind of equivalent, like they're like, suggestions.
Yeah.
They would commend you if did, but the cool thing about them is that for each one that they're like, don't do this, there are two positive things you can do. So for example, killing is a don't. We'd say, if you ask us, don't kill. But so the two positive things that you can do, and maybe one is more neutral, but one is not killing. Not killing is a good thing to do. Killing is
Hmm.
bad. Not killing is good. What's the second thing that you can do that's even better than not killing is helping live, feeding someone, giving
Yep.
someone medicine. And so I feel like in that example where the person is like, covering their ass to be like, look, I don't know, I didn't see the thing. I didn't do anything. Yeah, you didn't kill anyone, but you also didn't do the best version of the thing that you could have done,
Yep.
which was to help live.
Yep. Yeah. I totally
Though,
agree with
yeah.
that.
Though also in Buddhist terms, I think if you did divert it such that you took action to save 5 lives, and you took action to end one life, and you would also then, I think, technically speaking, acquire a karma of killing. But I think that there would be like, it's kind of an asterisk of
Yeah.
understanding that like there's a story of like the Buddha in one of his previous lives before he was like fully awake, that he was on a ship or something, and he knew that somebody was going to kill someone else, and
Hmm.
he killed that person before they could kill, in part to save the person's life, but also to save that other, the would-be killer, from becoming a killer and developing, acquiring that karma. And I think the story was that the Buddha then, his next life, he was a hell being, but only for a moment. He was like in hell, but then bounced back and then had another human life at some point, and then eventually,
Oh,
fully
interesting.
woke. But
Interesting.
yeah, so yeah, absolutely, there are many filters.
That's exactly why it's still open ended. And
Yeah.
like, and we didn't even talk about like the divine command school of thought, where it's like, well, let's just say your god or gods tells you not to kill, and such that, well, I can't touch that lever. Potentially there's like a weird conundrum here. It's like, you can't touch the lever to kill the person, but yet you still know that you're killing 5 people. So, like, did your conscious choice to not turn the lever end up killing the 5 people? Like, because you're still going to end up killing,
Well,
essentially, and you're aware of it.
and this sort of, I mean, in some way, here's two things. One is this helps sort of revisits the discussion that we had about linguistics, where like, what is the definition of a term? Like the word to kill, like, certainly the extreme, like the prototypical Platonic ideal of killing is not standing by, not pulling a lever while 5 people die. Like an argument could be made that that's not the definition of killing. Letting die, absolutely. Whereas, of course, it's not just as simple as like, what is the definition? What does the word mean? What am I going to do? But the other thing is, I have a personal experience of like, you're familiar with what is the fly? There's like this insect that like people are like, you have to kill this insect because it's very harmful.
Just let's say it's like an invasive species.
Yeah.
I
had it in my head, but whatever it is, like it has a very clear look, and they're like in New York City, especially. Recently, I learned about it. In the past year or so, they're like, you gotta kill this because it'll be much more beneficial to the world, to the environment, to the society, to us. And it's hard for me to do that. It's not that like a divine being is telling me don't kill, but I'm like, I don't want to, even though I'm not sure what the exact circumstances are like of each one but yeah, I do my best not to kill any creature, any insect, anything if I can avoid it. I know it's life in this this paradigm, like seems so far, for the most part, for most people, for most beings, impossible to avoid suffering or causing suffering in some ways, but we can do our best.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that too. So, okay, I think we exhausted the trolley problem.
Yes.
The next one is another good. It's a classic one. And it's Theseus's ship.
Oh yeah, big fan.
So, you have a ship, Theseus's ship, right? And over time, you have things being replaced. Let's say it's a plank, plank by plank, or piece by piece, and it ends up that it's totally replaced.
And it's all out to sea. Like while you're out to sea, you replace one plank, and you're like, well, that's still Theseus's ship, and you replace another, and eventually every plank is replaced. And then you're like, well, but every step of the way, it was still Theseus's ship. It's just one plank different from the one before.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? Is it actually Theseus's ship, or is this another like play on words, and we have to use linguistics?
Great question. I mean, spoiler alert, the answer is going to be yes. But here's just to conclude, the way that I've heard it is that then that ship, the new ship, comes back to land, and they're like, here's Theseus' ship. Then they take all the planks that were the original ship that they had, and then they built a new ship out of it. And they're like, now that's the original planks. And they're like, wait, but which one is Theseus' ship? Is it this one? Is it that one?
Oh, okay.
And so I think that, I mean, I'll look to linguistics, but I'll also look to Buddhism here, where the thing that is true of everything, the largest category in Buddhism is the selfless, the things that lack a self, the things that lack a inherent, permanent, unchanging, ultimate self. That is everything. Nothing has an unchanging, permanent self in the Buddhist paradigm. And it makes sense to me that like ourselves, like you can think in physics, the molecules of our existence, like the quarks, the electrons, and everything, they are constantly disappearing and reappearing and being replaced. And so like from moment to moment, we are not made of, whatever we need to be, identical matter, like you'd be like, oh, colloquially, you're you, I'm me, your name is your name, my name is my name. We're all a Theseus's ship, but the baby that we were like is made of completely different cells, completely different matter, and also completely different memory experiences. Like unless you remember every moment of your life, like most of us don't remember, coming like into it, like being conceived. Most of us don't remember being born. Most of us don't remember, like I don't have a lot of memories before the age of 2 or 3, and then it's very sparing. And so I feel like it's a very real, like, have you heard this thing? They say in a Buddhist. I don't know if it's from it specifically or just aligned with it. The idea that the same person cannot step into the same river twice, because
Mhm.
like, what does it mean to be the same river? Obviously, the water that's rushing by now is not the water that rushed by a moment ago. Is not like the Nile is the Nile. The Amazon is the Amazon, but also like the water is completely different all of the time. So what does it mean to be the same river? And that we are those as well. We're a completely different set of atoms, a completely different, like, and even the planet, we're like, oh, at least the Earth is the same, right? Like the planet is changing. We're in a different location than we've ever been in, relative to where we were. The
Yeah.
solar system, the galaxy is hurtling through the cosmos.
Yep.
uh, and so, yeah, so I think that, again, yes, back to linguistics, the question of, is it the same ship? Is it Theseus's ship? Is context dependent and definition dependent, which is, kind of like
Yeah.
the Killjoy version of like, I mean, it kind of, you talk about, I remember when I first heard about like the chicken or the egg, like which came first. And I'm like, well, probably the egg, because dinosaurs were around before the chicken, and dinosaurs laid eggs. And so definitely there was an egg before there was a chicken. And people are like, no, no, no. Okay. But the question is like, is it the chicken egg or the chicken? So now not a dinosaur egg, a chicken egg or a chicken that came first. And I'm like, well, then it really depends on the definition of a chicken egg. Is a chicken egg an egg that a chicken comes out of, or an egg that comes out of a chicken? Because for the most part, those are the same. But go back enough, along the spectrum of dinosaur evolution to chicken, let's say, there
Mhm.
might have, you could, if you wanted to, be like, well, at which point is it a chicken, and at which point is it a dinosaur? And so that at that point, did a dinosaur lay an egg that a chicken came out of? And is that egg a dinosaur egg or a chicken egg? And then there's your answer. I mean, it's like Zen koans. Like they're not meant to be, and like they can't be answered literally, objectively, in some universal framework, because no such framework exists.
Yeah, that's fair. The chicken or the egg question, actually, it gets on my nerves a little bit, because there's a little like, it's like, okay, let's actually get into the weeds if you want to have a real answer here, because I can literally just say to you now, it's like, well, chickens aren't technically dinosaurs. They're like they're descendants of theropod dinosaurs. So it's like, well, technically, yes.
That's so, and also, but not so. A chicken, if you could argue, then a chicken is a dinosaur, but is a dinosaur a chicken, or is it a square rectangle set subset relationship? Like,
It's a
would you say
subset relationship.
yes?
Yeah.
There are dinosaurs that weren't chickens. So
Right.
the same way that we can say, we're animals, but when we say humans and animals, we really mean humans and other animals. So we could say, chickens are dinosaurs, but when we talk about chickens, we're like chickens and non-chicken dinosaurs.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, or
It's
non-dinosaur chickens. Yeah,
That's exactly
depending.
why we have taxonomy, to try to sort through this garbage. Because if not, it's like, oh man, it would be
A-
very frustrating.
Absolutely. I mean, it's in Buddhism, the concept of something being the same. Like, there's,
Hmm.
by definition, they would say that something is the same if it is the same object and has the same name. And so, like, even if there was something that could be called two different things, like, Mike and Mr. Kaplan, they would say, is Mike the same, as the same entity, the same phenomenon as Mr. Kaplan? The answer would be no. We're mutually exclusive phenomena. We're like, we refer to the same object, but in order for it to be technically the same, it has to be Mike is the same as Mike. Mr. Kaplan is the same as Mr. Kaplan. And then that gets us into the same, river shenanigans that we had before, because
Hmm.
from moment to moment, there is no one thing that, I mean, by practical usage, we're like, yeah, I'm Mike. I was Mike a second ago. I'll be Mike in a second. But there's no one thing that we can point at
Yeah.
across time and space to be like, yes, this Mike, always Mike.
Hmm. Good point. Good point. Yeah, you look at it microscopically, it's
Yeah.
like, well, no. But like
Yeah.
macroscopically, yeah, Mike, you're Mike. You're not changing, but you are,
Yeah.
which makes a boatload of sense.
There's a famous like Buddhist teacher who like gets asked questions like, who was I in a previous life, if rebirths are real. And the question the guy's he's like, well, who's asking? Uh, uh,
uh,
Also, I have an answer. Funny, there's a Zen master or a Buddhist teacher named Suzuki Roshi, or Shunryu Suzuki, I think is his given name, maybe. And I love his stuff. And I read a book of his, little stories that people shared about him. And a student asked him once, like the classic question of like, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? And Suzuki Roshi answered, it doesn't matter.
yeah, it's fun. Like these are fun. Like again, the thought experiments is fun. Have we wasted a lot of time on it? Eh,
What
again,
else? What else are you up to? Yeah.
subjective opinion. It's fun. If you like these sort of things, but it does. I don't know.
Yes.
Again, so it's all opinion based. So the last one,
Yes.
baby Hitler. Run me through it.
I mean, I feel like the question is like, if you could go back in time and kill Hitler when he was a baby, which would then, hopefully make it so that he didn't. I mean, it's kind of the trolley problem again.
Yeah.
I just that only just occurred to me that like, there's, right now 6 million Jews and, various, queer people and disabled people and
Gypsies
the
and all
Roma
sorts of
people.
stuff.
Yeah.
Mhm.
All the people that were murdered because of the Holocaust, because of
Mhm.
Hitler, they're on one side of the trolley path. And what do you want to turn the crank and head down the one where it's just running over a baby that is Hitler? Which, the question, of course, is like, I mean, do you want to kill a baby?
Yeah.
Certainly to everyone around there, they'd be like, whoa, you just killed a baby. And I mean, I feel like it's such an interesting question that like, why leap to murdering the baby as opposed to like kidnapping the baby and raising it better, like.
Yeah.
And of course also he like sort of disregards all of the other factors beyond Hitler as an individual, like that were going on societally in Germany at the time, that made possible the rise of a dictator as such. But yeah, I mean, short answer is it's just the trolley problem again. So whatever you say for the trolley problem, it's actually way more people on the
Mhm.
line. So if you'd save 5 people that by killing one adult, but you're like, but it's a baby, such a sweet little, but like, well, then go kill him later. Kill him when however old the person on the trolley path was when Hitler reaches that age, whatever age you would kill someone on a trolley with a trolley, do it to Hitler if you can. Like, nope, it's got to be a baby. Got to choose. Like, okay, well, great question.
Yeah.
But and the answer always ends up being like, well, glad time travel doesn't exist because this would really throw things out of whack.
Yeah, most definitely. Off the air, like talking to different people, it's always fun to hear these answers because, it's like, oh, well then I guess you kind of resonate with that school of thought. That's neat. I didn't know that about you. Cool.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. These are obviously like extreme examples, but then like once you know somebody's kind of school of thought, then you could kind of like predict what they might do in a certain circumstance wherever there's like a moral conflict.
Yeah, and here's something that I never thought of until right now.
Ooh.
There's I don't think I need to tell this old joke, but there's this sexist like sex worker shaming joke where it's like somebody says to a person, "Would you have sex with me for $1 billion?" And the person says, "Yes, I would." And then they say, "Would you have sex with me for $1?" And then they say, "Who do you think I am?" And then, or what do you think I am? And then they say, well, we've already established that. Now we're just haggling for a price. And like I didn't put any genders in it, but historically it's been sexist. It's been anti, sex worker in a way that I disagree with. But I feel like conceptually that points to the idea that obviously it's I mean, I think that joke illuminates that things don't operate the same way on the small scale as they do on the big scale. The big scale and
Yeah.
the small scale are different. And so the analogy that I thought of just right now is like, oh yeah, like Newtonian versus quantum physics. Like like literally, like on the smallest scale, like Newtonian physics don't work the same way they do on the large scale, and quantum physics doesn't work on the large scale. And that's not like a gotcha moment. Be like, aha, so which one is it? You got to be just one physics. And like, oh yeah, maybe it makes sense that that one set of rules work for large things and one set of rules work for small things, and
Hmm.
then where does it switch over? That maybe that's an interesting question. But because these are extreme circumstances, these like, would you kill baby Hitler, or would
Yeah.
you kill a person right in front of you under these circumstances? Like, maybe sadly they don't tell us as much about, you know, who we are and how we would live and how we think a society should work in the non-extraordinary, non-extreme case, because the extreme cases, maybe, yeah, we know what we do in those extreme cases, but do those actually teach us what we would do? I mean, good thought experiments to think about, like, well, what would I do in life if somebody, you know, if a child is drowning in front of me, or if somebody is asking me for $1 because they need money. And a quick thing, I just saw a study that like people, the unhoused in some city were given, just like given money, like some, you know, some thousands of dollars. And like the worry that people always have, you know, stereotypically, when they're like, they're just going to use it to buy drugs or alcohol, or, and the good news is, in this actual real life experiment, they bought housing, they paid for vehicles, they, you know, they bought food, they paid for the things that we would all want to use our money to live our lives. So it is nice to be able to do some like real world
Yeah.
ethical philosophical examination as well.
No, that's really cool. If you could like find that study and
Yeah,
send it to me, that would be awesome. I'd love to have that.
I will seek it out.
Sweet, cool. Okay, so I think we're wrapping up here on the philosophy of ethics and
Yeah.
talking about our open-ended dilemmas. And the last one that I think would be fun is the talk about determinism versus free will. And I feel like we shouldn't have to define that. I feel like everybody is familiar
Yeah.
with that. So tell me what are your thoughts? What camp do you sit in?
Yeah.
And you know, feel free to be devil's advocate, or feel
uh,
free to give the counter arguments too.
I'll be the angel's advocate.
Ooh.
um Devil's advocate, why do we need the devil to advocate, or an advocate for the devil? But um here, I'll say three specific things.
Mhm.
Number one, I think that, let's see, what order do I want to do them in? One is going to be another Buddhist thing. One is going to be about how I sort of think about fate. And third one is just the brief overview is, I think that, like, you know, number one, who am I? I'm but one human being in this moment. And I'm not an authority. I do not have all of the information in the universe, but it seems to me, based on what I've seen, read, and experienced, that if I had to pick a binary, which maybe I don't, maybe this is another spectrum from determinism to free will, but if given the choice of there is free will or there is not free will, I think that there is not free will, but it pays for us to act as though there is free will, because if you just like, no free will, so it doesn't matter what I do, so I'm just going to do nothing, well, then you're fated to do nothing. Whereas if you're like, who knows whether I'm fated to or not, and especially because I don't know and you don't know, if anyone knows, let us know. But, you know, do the things that make sense to do, that feel good to do, that are fulfilling, that are enjoyable. And if at the end of your life you find out you're like, you were just fated, you were just destined to do all those things, well, then good. Then you picked a good destiny, or destiny picked a good you.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one. What the reason that that one of the reasons that I think this is, you know, like I said, in Buddhism, another aspect of it is that all phenomena are caused by, like, are the effect of some cause, that there's causes and conditions. And like often it's, you can sort of zoom in or zoom out as much as you want. Like, you know, we are caused by our parents in some way, but also we, like, the version of ourselves that exists right now is caused by the version of ourselves from a moment ago, from a day
Yeah.
ago, from the choices and thoughts that we had and made yesterday and last week, and go back as far as you can. So you can always, like, you know, a pot is caused by a potter and clay. And And so you can, zoom in as granularly as you wish, to the moment, or you can zoom out and be like, oh yeah, so, life on Earth was caused by the Big Bang at some point, with some other intermediary causes along the way. But if you get really granular about it, if you keep going back far enough, and this actually will get into ethics as well. In the very first ethics class, or one of the first ethics classes I took in college, one day we talked about a killer, like a real life murderer who killed two people and just sat there in the car with these two dead people eating their lunch until the police arrived and brought him to jail. And he seemed heartless. He seemed like a sociopath, a psychopath. And we were like, wow, like, should this person, be put to death? What should this person, what should happen? Like, what's going on? Isn't this the worst kind of person that you can imagine? And then the next day we discussed a different scenario where there had been a father who's of several, who his wife was pregnant and he didn't think that it was his own baby. And so he shunned her and abused her. And I think the baby was born premature because he kicked her in her stomach. And it was this horrendous thing. And and that baby, because he thought it wasn't his, he was if anyone touches that baby, I beat them or I kill them. And he would sometimes legitimately, this is just a true story that I remember, where he would get his gun and just be everyone out in 30 seconds or I start shooting. And and this baby grew up, without the care that it needed, without physical touch, without love. And we're like, wow, what a horrible thing, the worst thing that could happen to that baby. And then we find out that baby is who grew up into the killer from the day before. And so we're like, when does moral responsibility kick into gear? We're like, if any of us, if we were born in those circumstances, we would have been that baby. We would have been that person. When did the baby have any choice? When did that person, when he turned 18, it's such an arbitrary thing. The heap, we didn't talk about the heap paradox, but things add up and we're eventually it's a heap, but when did it become a heap? When did we become a morally responsible individual? And then I'm not saying that we shouldn't say that we are morally responsible individuals, living in a society. It makes sense. I mean, the practical question of what do we do when a person turns out like that? But you can trace it back all the way. The killer turned out that way in large part due to how he was parented or not parented, how the circumstances of his nature and non-nurture. And then the father, similarly, that way as well. There's a Buddhist sage called Shantideva who he said something if somebody hits us with a stick, we don't get mad at the stick, or it's not reasonable to get mad at the stick because the stick is just like a tool, an agent by which we are being hit. And he says, furthermore, the person is kind of like the stick as well. The person is also the victim of circumstances, the victim of this delusion that we're all under. And he's if you're going to be mad at anything, be mad at the delusion. And the delusion of the person who's hitting you with the stick is probably even greater than the person who's getting hit with the stick. Of course, try to get away from the person, try to avoid the person getting hit with the stick, try to help people so that they don't end up hitting people with sticks or murdering people. This is very complex, but the point is that you go back far enough, and when we were babies, we weren't in charge, we weren't in control. And at what point, is there a point that you could point at and be that's where I became, in control of my life, my faculties, my consciousness, my whatever. And of course, it's maybe a greater or lesser thing, a sandwichier thing that now, as an adult, I certainly have at least more semblance of control over my behavior, over my actions, but I am not really in charge in any moment of everything is based on the Rube Goldberg machine of atoms smashing together, of neurons firing that started that to point to a place and be that's where it started. That's where free will began. I feel and I mean, maybe the way to free will, if you want to say that there is free will, is to say maybe I gave the instrumentation of my own theory's demise in saying well, maybe at very small, the very small numbers thing, very small is different than very large. And once you are large, maybe there is something that operates differently than than at the small scale. Maybe, maybe an adult is different than a baby, I guess is what I'm saying. But I don't know when or where or how to parse it to point. So that's why determinism makes a lot of sense to me. But also it makes a lot of sense to not think of it. So the third aspect of what I'm going to share is that, like, is there fate? Do you ever watch The Price is Right?
Yes, I have
Yeah.
in my life. Yeah.
Bob Barker, rest in peace. There was a game
Great
called
guy.
Plinko. Do you know the game Plinko?
I've heard of it. Yeah. I've
So
never watched it, but
the way Plinko exists is there's these like discs, and there's kind of like a board of pegs.
mhm.
And at the bottom, there are like these different slots where the disc can end up after bouncing off all of the pegs in a way that seems like it's impossible to, know from where you start it. You're like, you try to get it into like the highest money, but
Mhm.
who knows? But if you do it and it gets there and you try to do it again, the slightest alternate factor will bring it to a completely, the complete other side of the thing.
Mhm.
And so I think that is sort of a great like exemplification of the way that, like, in my life, that fate works, that looking back, like that fate exists looking backwards, be like, oh, I know exactly how that got here. Looking
Yeah.
forward, so like looking forwards, act like there's free will. Looking backwards, act like, well, this is the only thing that did happen, so it's the only thing that really could have happened based on all of the scientific forces, all of the gravity, all of everything in the universe led to this Plinko chip going exactly here to where it is. And like, it's like that with my career also. Like, how do you become a comedian? I'm like, well, for me, I started out in Boston in 2002. And then in 2006, I went to Seattle and did a competition there where I met somebody who invited me to another festival the next year where a college booking agent saw me. And by that point, I'd had an hour of material that I was like, I'd love to perform it at colleges. And they're like, we'll book you. And then I got into this. It's not a competition, but it's this conference that you apply to called NACA, and you show up and then you perform for all of these. It's very competitive to get into it because you perform for 100 different schools, maybe. And if you do well, then maybe they book you. And maybe I booked like 10 or 20 schools. And then I could pay my rent for a certain amount of time and not have to do the job where I was working at the linguistics department anymore, which I love doing, but I was happy to make
Mhm.
more at a college than I was in several weeks of work at that job and getting to do the thing that I loved. And I'm like, and if you're like, so I'm like, I can look back at the Plinko chip of my career and be like, I understand exactly how I got to where I was. But for anyone else to try to replicate that exactly, be like, yeah, I mean, you could try to be like, oh yeah, like go to open mics, like write, perform, watch, read, live a life worth
Mhm.
commenting on and considering, take in the art that you want. And so, yeah, so I think that, yes, I believe in that. My final answer: determinism and fate backwards, and free will, or at least the semblance of it, the possibility of it, the hope for it, the positive results of believing those things moving forward.
Okay, that's really fair. I mean, you probably stated everything that I was going to state. Just on a great, like, you had a lot of great analogies and stories
Thank
there.
you.
One quick thing that I think to really summarize everything that you said is that you know chaos does exist, and chaos is deterministic. Our brains are chaotic. Our life is chaotic. Things are chaotic, but it still is deterministic. The only time where you get rebuttal from anybody that is in the free will camp that wants to say, well, this isn't deterministic, is like some aspects of quantum mechanics. And it's like, yes, but it's random. It's not that it's not that it, like, there's a will happening, right? That's the one thing that bothers me the most from from the foundations of quantum mechanics, with like Everettian versus Copenhagen. And Copenhagen is like, well, there's an agent. You have to have you have to measure it. It has to be an agent has to do the measuring. And it's like, no, that's not really how that works. But like, it's you know, it, yeah, we're not getting into that. But the fact is that quantum mechanics isn't a willed thing. It is either a determined or a random thing, and that's a different way of going at it than say that it's willed.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I feel like that's on the tiniest level. It obviously operates differently than on like the human level, where I don't know if you've read the book by Dan Ariely called Predictably Irrational. It's all about how human behavior is irrational, but often in predictable ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is some hope. There's some help for us if we, examine it enough.
Yeah. And another thing that we should probably talk about is that, there's, and you said like, there's nothing wrong with having the thought that free will does exist. And whether it does or it doesn't, we should still live our lives and whatever, whether it was or it wasn't. The scientific evidence points towards one more than the other, but at the same time, the scientific evidence doesn't really take into account the emotional aspect of the individual. And so sometimes that can lead to, a fatalistic worldview. And that's not what we want, right? Whenever we say like, oh, things are deterministic, we don't want you to become fatalistic. That's not what we want here. So definitely, there's nothing wrong with feeling like you have control in your life in some aspect. However, if you want to go about it in a more sciencey route, the way that at least our brain works from kind of what we understand is exactly how you explained it, where you have the genetic aspect and also the social implications that like build our brain, right? And when you're going throughout life and you're having these experiences and stuff, your brain is storing this information such that whenever something happens in the world and you have to make it, or whenever a decision has to be made, on the macroscopic level, your brain has a category of ways to respond. And if you feel like without free will, there is no optimism, there's no way in which I can have good change, that's not true, because your brain has many different ways, many different things stored that could arise to an optimistic, like it can respond to an optimistic stimuli. So, which can result in good change. So, to say that there is no way that you're going to have good change and nothing's going to benefit you is not true.
Yeah, and I'll add a less sciency offering that I think that the thing that I'm about to say, I think is utilitarian in that I think it will hopefully bring joy to more people than otherwise. And also, I think that on a Kantian level, I would will everyone to feel this way as well. I would say that I know it's sometimes it feels like I am choosing to believe that there is determinism, but on the other hand, I feel like I can't help but believe that there is free will. I mean, and if you believe in free will, but there is no free will, well, then you have no choice. So just keep believing it.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that too. Yeah. So, I was expecting more of a debate on that, but I'm glad we don't have to debate. It's good that we align on that aspect. Mike, it has been fantastic to have you on the podcast. We've talked about so much. I got to learn a lot, and I'm sure whoever's watching or listening definitely learned a lot from this, from linguistics to different aspects in philosophy, and maybe took away a different worldview. Who knows? So
Well,
thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, cheers.
Cool.
That is all for this episode of Everything STEAM. I just wanted to take a quick second and thank Mike for sharing his knowledge and expertise on linguistics, philosophy, history, and everything else that we discussed in the podcast. If you want to see more of Mike's content, just head to our website, everythingsteam.org, go to this episode's page, and connect with Mike via that way, or you can just look up Mike Kaplan anywhere on social media. He's literally all over the place, and he makes amazing content. I would also love to mention my amazing team for their collective efforts to make this show happen. This podcast was edited by Ariel Piermont. The clips that you'll see on social media were created by our intern, Molly Chakery, and our episode art was created by Gabrielle Edmiston. After the episode, please give our podcast a rating and review on whatever platform you get your podcasts on. We're always looking for feedback, and the rating would greatly help us out in the fight against those algorithms. Lastly, be sure to check us out on all the socials for podcast news, upcoming episodes, and just fun STEAM content. Just search Everything STEAM on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook to join in on the fun. Once again, thank you for listening to Everything STEAM. I'm your host, Sam Stanford, and as always, stay curious.